name is Ursa Eyer, and I am an artist usually. And I also hustle different jobs because I'm an artist. So it's, you got to make that money.
So, what type of art do you do? I'm looking around at some interesting stuff.
I mostly make comic books. I do a lot of illustration type work, and it always kind of depends on the inspiration. So it can go into 3D or painting, but predominantly illustration and comic books.
So so graphics as well as the narrative, or
Right. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Narrative work.
So, how long have you lived in New Orleans?
I moved to New Orleans when I was 3. And I'm 29 now. So 26 years, is that right? I don't do math very well. 26 years.
And so you were here before Katrina.
Yes.
And where did you grow up in New Orleans?
Gentilly.
In Gentilly.
Yeah.
And what was your life like growing up in New Orleans? Tell us a little bit about the Gentilly area in particular.
It was good. Gentilly is pretty. It was definitely a family area. It was mostly families. It was pretty mixed in terms of race, which is not always the case in New Orleans. New Orleans has a tendency to kind of have big chunks, and I remember that Gentilly was always pretty integrated. And I went to Gentilly Terrace, and that was fine. I had a really good art teacher there. Yeah, my life growing up was pretty good.
Can you tell me sort of the things that, when you think of New Orleans and you think of home, what are the things that you think of?
When I think of New Orleans, I guess I think of community, just being embraced by the people around me. When I went to college in Baltimore, I was pretty shocked by by things like people not telling me hello when I'm walking down the street, and people being really uncomfortable when I said hello to them. And then the artist community was pretty cutthroat, which was very different from here, because everybody here always seemed to want to kind of rise together, and you want to pull each other in. So yeah, I guess my biggest impression of New Orleans is how much people sort of include each other, more so than I've experienced in other places.
So were you here during Katrina?
It was my freshman year of college. So I'd been gone about 2 weeks, I think, when Katrina hit.
And you still had family back here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did evacuate. They were not planning on it, and probably had I been here, at least my mom wouldn't have, because I was such a brat that I would have been no, we're just gonna stay, it's fine. But my aunt had a really bad dream the night before, and so as the next day they all evacuated.
Wow. So what was New Orleans like when you came back post Katrina? Were there any differences?
Yeah. When I came back a lot. I visited a lot after, and it was really barren, and there weren't any birds or trees. It's really, I don't know. I don't really know how to describe what it was like immediately after. Do is that like, would you prefer for me to talk about how it is now, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's really up to you what you want to
Okay.
talk about. I think the things I'm interested in knowing are, what if anything has changed in New Orleans pre and post Katrina. So that's where you think that would start or end or not or whatever.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess there's definitely a lot that's different now. A lot of it is like related to, for instance, this neighborhood is like a lot wealthier. I think there's like a lot more wealth in New Orleans, or it feels at least that way. Like a lot more affluent young people are here, and that's got its good aspects and its bad aspects.
Would you describe the good and the bad in that?
Yeah, I mean, I benefit from it a lot because I am, there's a lot of new, like, creative people here that wouldn't have been here otherwise. The majority of the people that work out of this space, for instance, are all transplants.
Can you describe this space? Where are we?
We're at the Aquarium Gallery and Studios. It's owned by actually like a New Orleans native who bought the place completely blighted. Like it was so jacked up, and we fixed it up, sort of. And we just have a bunch of artists that all have like residencies here, making whatever work they want to make. And it is predominantly like transplants, but there's a couple of like locals who are chilling here as well. But it's in the Bywater, which historically was a like kind of lower income black neighborhood. And now, like, if you wanted to buy a house here, I think there was like a single down the street that was going for like $250,000, and it was like kind of a jacked up looking house. Like, the cost of living has definitely skyrocketed, and like the lower income individuals are like definitely getting pushed further and further out of this situation. So there are things that I benefit from because I am an artist, so I have more of a, like, I see more people, I have more of a community, and I'm like a vegetarian, so like people are bringing like kale and shit into the community. And I bike everywhere, so there are bike lanes everywhere. And so there's a lot of like things that are really great for me. But I think the cost of that might not be worth it, because there's a lot of people who 100% belong here that cannot live here anymore, or were never able to come back. So those are the goods and the bads, I guess. There's good stuff, but cost of living is terrible, and I think the people that really belong here deserve to be here. People who are from here.
So tell me more about your work. Do you have examples of anything?
Yeah, I mean, the examples are kind of all around the room.
We could focus on more of those afterwards. Like,
Okay.
You can get some photos.
We'll move around.
What is
Okay.
So what is sort of your process when you're working?
It depends on what I'm working on. So when I make comic books, I usually like scribble insanely into this book. So it like mostly looks like this in here. And it's just a lot of that. So if anybody like found it, they would be like, oh, okay, this is a crazy person. And I shouldn't read this. But eventually it gets translated onto larger paper. So the process is like mostly about like sort of ripping out ideas and concepts and narratives and turning them into comic books.
Do you work mostly in like a traditional medium, or do you do stuff digitally?
Yeah, I do. I start out on paper and, ink and brush.
Do you paint?
And-
digitally? Like,
and then I scan it all in and like use digital media. So it can most of my stuff's online, really. Like I do illustration work that I have prints made out of, but for the most part, like you can find me online. That's like where I exist as an artist.
So tell us a little bit more about the art community here in New Orleans. You said it's now a blending of transplants and natives, even in this space. So
I would say that's definitely more so for the St. Claude district, which is like the St. Claude Arts District came about really post-Katrina. Before that, we had like Royal Street and we had Julia Street, and those were where you would find art. And Royal Street was kind of like Julia Street was like really the like, you know, hoity-toity, like, you know, we're fancy kind of area. Still is. It has White Linen Night, and then Royal Street hated that, so they have Dirty Linen Night because, you know. And so the St. Claude district is really interesting because it's like owned. Every space that I know of is owned by the artists, which is very different from Royal Street and Julia Street. So it's mostly collectives, and that's really cool. Like, it's really great to have kind of just artists making art for other artists to look at. And, like, you know, it's really cool when other people show up too, but it's not so much about, for me, I don't know, you could probably talk to other people and they'll be like, that's not true. Like, we would really like money. But for me, I feel like it's more about the experience of like making art and like being with other artists and like exchanging ideas instead of like, how do I become really marketable and like sell my work for like $25,000. So there's a difference for sure.
what do you think, or if you were pressed, what would you say are the things that you're most passionate about?
I think art is number one, which I guess is, I don't know. Art is definitely really high up there, and then it kind of peters down to like social issues. So I'm like pretty intense feminist, and I'm pretty outspoken about like racial issues, especially when it comes to how it happens in New Orleans. So I think those are the things that I pay the most attention to and I feel like most passionately about is like art and rights.
So tell me a little bit about the feminist part then. I'm kind of curious because there was one interviewee we talked to who described a sense of sometimes a sense of concern about being a woman in New Orleans, even though she's a New Orleans native.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to somebody talking about that? Do you understand where they're coming from, and what is that issue?
I think I do, but my perspective is a little warped because I've only lived in New Orleans and Baltimore. So I've only ever lived in spaces where people are like, that's too dangerous to live, and be a woman. But for me, I think my perspective may have been shaped because of that. I think I am very like surly. When I like walk down the street, I have a tendency to, there are lots of things that I do to prepare myself to like be an individual by myself on the street, especially at night. And I think probably in other places it's not like that. But I don't feel, I'm not afraid really. I do understand why other people are. Because, I think we have a serial rapist right now, which, like, has changed the way, like, me. So in this space in particular, it's all women and then Jacob who owns the space. The other day, one of the girls was going home and she'd recently heard about this dude who was like running around raping people. So the dog Russell that you just saw, we just like handed Russell to her and we were like, we'll pick him up later so you can like walk home. And I think we all do, we do a lot of things to protect each other. The women in this community, like we are very vigilant. We walk in groups and we, call each other when we get home. Like there's a whole structure in place, at least with the people that I hang out with and I am friends with, because it is kind of scary. There's a lot that can happen and there's a lot of hollering that happens and a lot of harassment that happens, and that's like day to day. It's just to be expected.
And has that always been the case in New Orleans? Or is this something newish?
It's always been the case in New Orleans. I mean, I feel like it's always the case in most big cities. Not that New Orleans is a big city, but it's a city. And yeah, I mean, I think women are still in a position where we are a consumable in a way, and where people like don't respect us as individuals. And so whenever you're in a situation, and maybe it's because we're like also in the South, I'm not sure, because once again, I've lived in New Orleans and Baltimore. So I can't say that I'm an authority on it. But when we're out in the world, like people do feel like they can objectify us, and there's, that's cool. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, according to a lot of people. And if we say anything, they get bummed about it. They feel like, we're the ones being the assholes. So I think that's just like a systemic societal thing that like needs to change.
So you mentioned you're also outspoken on issues around race. Mm-hmm. What are the issues that you think, or that you've been speaking about recently?
I mean, I think, like, so New Orleans is inside Louisiana, which is like pretty notorious for like its incarceration rates. I think specifically in New Orleans, a big reason why the gentrification is so obvious and so extreme is because, we have a bunch of affluent kids coming in here, and there's still absolutely no resources, especially for like the black men who live here. Maybe because it's based on trust. People don't trust these guys, but I went to Gentilly Terrace, and I was probably, I would say, I was the only white kid in my graduating class from that school. Everybody else, I think everybody else was black, and I think there was like one Asian girl. And I always had more resources than them because I was white. And I, was pretty low income. So it wasn't completely based on income, but I still would end up with more opportunity than a lot of the kids that I went to school with, purely based on the color of my skin. And so I think that experience has been really frustrating. And I guess also living in an area where our police department is like especially corrupt. Once again, I don't really feel like I'm an authority on any of this, but from the experience and from like seeing how things have changed so much in this area, I don't think it's okay. Like, I think there has to be opportunity for the people who live here and belong here. And I don't think that that's here.
Do you see yourself staying here the rest of your life?
I don't know. I may not be able to afford to live here much longer. The area is very expensive. And so I am going to live here as long as it's possible. But I have been looking into other options as of recently.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions that are on this list of questions that I think I sent you. One of which is, are there any misconceptions or perceptions of New Orleans that you've heard from people who are not from New Orleans that you would like to address, that you would want to say something about?
I don't know. Will you repeat that?
Sure. So if you, and I'll change it a little.
I have to.
So, in some ways, yeah, this is kind of an opportunity. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was to give my friends at the time an opportunity to talk about what it is that they wanted people to know about New Orleans. And when we were first talking about this, the media coverage of New Orleans is what the media coverage is.
Right.
And they were responding to some of that. But the question, really, at the root of the question is, what do you want people to know about New Orleans, about living here, about your hopes for it, any of that? And if you don't have an answer, you don't have to. It's fine.
Well, I feel like that's such a loaded question, because I guess I do kind of feel like New Orleans, where it is now, and this may not be answering the question at all, so I'm sorry.
No, you're doing fine. There is no right or wrong here. It's sort of just, what you're thinking.
I guess I have a lot of pretty negative feelings about how New Orleans is perceived, even by people who came here after Katrina, because there's sort of a whitewashing of what happened here. So people will move into an area and they will be really pumped about it because maybe it was a good deal, because there might be a blighted area next door, but people lived there, and they were our neighbors and they were our friends, and I think that there's this major excitement about New Orleans that I can't fault anybody for, but there's a lot of opportunists that came in and sort of looked at Katrina as an opportunity and not a disaster. And I think there's a lot of stuff here that there are a lot of signs of that I still see, that brings me anxiety and stress and frustration. And even my friends who are not from here, there are things that they'll say that that sort of shows that they maybe don't fully comprehend what happened and what was lost. And I think anyone who's from here carries a lot of loss. And I want that to be understood and respected. And there's sort of this kind of like, you know, how like John Smith showed up and he like started boning Pocahontas, and like they were like, there was sort of this savages idea. Like it feels like that a little bit when you're a native here. There's a bunch of like people who are coming in and sort of acting like we don't know what we're doing and that we're doing it wrong. And I don't think we are. Like I don't think that the way that we conduct our lives, and like maybe just because we were a pretty undereducated population, that doesn't mean that the way that we conducted ourselves was wrong. So there's a lot of that I find really frustrating and stressful. So that may not have answered the question at all, but that's kind of where I guess I'm coming from. I don't want people to think that, I think you should know what we went through.
So there were two things you mentioned that really kind of struck chords with me. One was the whitewashing, that phrase, whitewashing of what happened, and two, what was lost. So would you feel comfortable unpacking those two pieces a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
So first tackling, you know, what was whitewashed, what was glossed over?
When Katrina happened, first of all, a lot of lower income individuals died, and everybody else was shipped off to wherever. They were shipped to places that they didn't know where they were going. And then many of them haven't had the opportunity to come back. And a lot of them like made their lives in different locations. But when I live in New Orleans now, it feels like I don't know. It feels like maybe there's no there's no attempt to think about or like try to get those people back. And a lot of people who live here don't know about those people and don't know, or maybe don't care, because immediately after everybody came back, there was sort of this celebration of like, oh, now it's a new start, and like, oh, we sent all of our crime to Texas. This is awesome, you know? And that was, I mean, it was celebrated here that we lost a giant portion of our population. And I feel like I don't understand why you would celebrate that. I don't understand like why that would be okay.
So the loss that you were referring to earlier is the loss of people.
We lost
Are there
people.
other things associated with that you feel you've lost?
We lost people, we lost culture. I mean, it wasn't just like, you know, we had all of these criminals that we managed to get rid of. Thank goodness Katrina happened. It was our culture that was sent away. And I think there are aspects of our culture that we are losing. There's a certain type of person that's not going to come back, that's not going to be here. So I think that's what has been glossed over.
So if pressed to pick 2 or 3 things that you think are positives that are happening now that may or may not have been here before Katrina, what would you say those are?
I mean, I think, once again, like, all the things that I am benefiting from, like, I think bike lanes are great because, you know, we have a high mortality rate there, too. A lot of people die on bikes here. And I think, you know, healthier food options. And, you know, once again, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm really pumped that I can actually, like, go to a restaurant now. So those things are great. I mean, I'm very excited. I'm excited about the St. Claude Arts District because, once again, it's owned by artists. And that opportunity wouldn't have come around probably if not for Katrina. You know, it started in blighted houses. And by having, like, sort of everything, all of the rules washed away, it gave people room to, you know, create kind of whatever they wanted.
At some point, toward the end of the interview, I asked people, Forrest, Pippa, and Katie, if they have questions they want to ask. So this will be that point in time.
My Katie.
I know, right?
Quit my birthday. No.
Just with like the housing scene here, you mentioned that there was a housing street that's like for
Quarter mil.
$250,000.
Yeah, it's like a single shotgun house.
So have you noticed it just here or like everywhere?
All over New Orleans. It's everywhere. I mean, that's why I was thinking of leaving. I was like, well, I'm not going to be able to buy a house. Renting is, if you can rent for under $1,000, you're doing a great job. Renting is probably, yeah, I mean, there's nowhere to rent. There's nowhere to buy if you are a lower income individual. It's really now for, I mean, even like, what was it? There was like, the best options for you is like a buyer. I was looking at a house that was, you know, no plumbing, no electricity. It was like, you know, this jacked up house, and it was for $80,000. You know, like just, you know, like half of the wall is covered in black mold, and it was just. But that's what it's like right now here, and I hear that it's like that everywhere. But New Orleans is really, I think a lot of people are looking at New Orleans right now. And so many people are buying right now here that the cost of living is just really high.
Do you think that's also like affected the job market as well? Like, is it easier to find jobs that would be conducive to that kind of housing market, or is it just?
I have no idea. I haven't looked for a job in a really long time, but I mean, it's great for, you know, our service industry. And I think there are a lot of new jobs being created, but it's hard to know. Like, it feels to me, and this is like just me being bitter probably. This might not be the case. But it feels to me that only people who don't live in New Orleans can afford to live in New Orleans now. Like, can afford to, like, be like, oh yeah, I'll buy that property. That'll be great. I don't know. But yeah, that's just like the bitter side of me talking. It's probably not that bad.
In terms of the art scene, have you seen like a lot of people being more? You said artists looking at other artists' work is really important, but at the same
Right.
time, like the people who come in here and can drop like $100,000 on like an apartment for a year or something, are they also getting included into the art scene and like involved as consumers, not artists themselves?
I think so. I think it's going to be a while. There are parts of the St. Claude's art arts district that that maybe caters more to that. But I think Julia Street is still sort of the place to go if you're like looking to drop a ton of money on some art.
I have one last question about the art scene, sorry guys.
Go ahead.
Janet was showing me a bunch of houses that had Katrina wood, and I know that that's seems to be a prevalent thing in the art community from what we've seen.
Yeah.
I just want to know your feelings on that, your opinions about using that.
When I first got back to New Orleans, there was a lot of Katrina art, and I hated it. Like, I thought it was just like the most, I was like, this is so opportunist, like these jerks. But they might have just actually been artists that were like experiencing pain and trying to make art about it. And then in Baltimore, a girl who came to help clean up did an installation that had a bunch of like things that she collected from New Orleans, and she did this like big art display about like Katrina, and I was furious. Like, I felt like, you know, what right do you have to like collect our stuff? Those were our things, and like pile them up and make and like try to make what's your statement? Like, what are you trying to say here? But I've kind of chilled out about that. Because I feel like that was, you know, really knee-jerk. And I think it's great that people are finding purposes for, like, repurposing things that otherwise would be garbage. And sort of, like, giving new life to things that otherwise maybe wouldn't have had a second life. I don't know. So it's cool. I'm cool with it now, but I used to be super angsty about it. Like, I used to be really pissed off.
Is there anything else that you would want to say?
Um,
A lot of times when we do these interviews, people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll do an interview. And then, you know, a day or so passes and they're thinking about it. It's like, well, they're thinking, what am I going to say at this interview? And then turns out a lot of times they have things they really do want to say. And I want to make sure I give you the opportunity to say that if there was something in there that you haven't been able to.
I tried to, like, not think about it until you guys showed up, which may have been a bad idea. But, no, I mean, I think everything that I have to say was said.